Right. So you're here with us on the deep dive because, let's be honest, you really want to like wrap your head around some, some pretty big and kind of complicated stuff out there.
Absolutely.
But you want to do it without spending, hours and hours.
Right.
So today we're going to dive into something that's making its way through the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
Down there in Washington, D.C. We're talking about House Bill 30, which actually just moved over to the Senate on January 17th of this year, 2025. So pretty recent stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And what we're going to try to do in this deep dive is to really get to the bottom of, what this bill is all about. What are the big changes it's trying to make?
Yeah.
Particularly when we're talking about immigration law.
Yeah.
Specifically, folks with a history of either sex offenses or domestic violence.
Right.
And to do that, we're going to really focus on the actual text of House Bill 30 as it was referred to the Senate.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Right off the bat, this bill has a pretty straightforward title, and it seems to kind of lay out its intentions pretty clearly. Right?
Yeah. It does.
What's the official name for this thing?
Well, the bill actually states right up front that its short title is the Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act.
Okay.
So right away.
Right away.
It's pretty clear what they're aiming for.
Yeah, it's very focused.
Yes.
So the core of this bill seems to be about making some pretty significant changes to what's called the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Right.
And this is like the foundation of immigration law. And specifically, it seems to focus on, who gets to come into the United States and who might be removed.
Exactly.
So let's start with this idea of inadmissibility.
Okay.
Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah.
What does that even mean when we're talking about immigration?
Yeah, so inadmissibility basically means there are legal reasons that prevent someone from being allowed to legally enter the U.S.
Okay.
And Section 2 of this House Bill 30, it wants to add new reasons why someone might be considered inadmissible.
Okay.
And it does this by changing or amending a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act, specifically Section 212A2.
Gotcha.
So one of the really interesting things here is that they're adding sex offenses as like a whole separate category.
Okay, so that's a new thing.
Yeah, that's a big addition.
So let's dig into that a little bit. What would make someone inadmissible, under this new sex offense category?
So they get really specific here.
Okay.
They actually point directly to a different law, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006.
Okay.
And they say, okay, we're using the definition of sex offense from that act.
Okay, and the Adam Walsh Act, that was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big piece of legislation. It set up a national registry for sex offenders.
Right.
And it really spelled out what different sex offenses are.
Okay.
So if someone's been convicted of a sex offense as defined by that act, or if they admit they did it, or even if they admit to doing things that basically are the same as a sex offense,
Wow.
then they would be inadmissible. And that includes people who conspired to commit a sex offense as well.
So it's not just like you did the thing, it's also
Right.
like you planned to do the thing.
Exactly. So it's
Yeah.
a pretty broad category.
Okay, so we've got these sex offenses. Now, this bill also talks about domestic violence.
Yeah.
And stuff like that, right? And how that plays into inadmissibility.
Exactly. That's in a newly proposed subsection they're calling K.
Okay.
In this section, it's basically laying out several different reasons why someone might be considered inadmissible if they have a history of these kinds of issues.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Like, what specific things are they looking at?
So it includes things like being convicted of or admitting to
Okay.
a crime of domestic violence,
Okay.
a crime of stalking, a crime of child abuse, which they're very specific about, including neglect and abandonment under that umbrella, and then also a crime of violating a certain part of a protection order.
Okay, so when we say crime of domestic violence or violating a protection order, are they like defining those terms specifically?
They are, yeah. They actually send us back to a different part of the Immigration and Nationality Act itself.
Okay.
Section 237A2E.
Gotcha.
And that's where they define those terms.
Okay.
And when they're talking about a protection order, they're specifically interested in the part of the order that's supposed to protect someone from credible threats of violence, repeated harassment, or bodily injury.
Okay, so it's very specific.
Yeah.
It's not just like any kind of protection order. It's got to be this.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
very targeted.
Okay, so those are all the ways that someone could be prevented from even coming into the country.
Right.
And what about the other side of this? What about people who are already here?
Mm-hmm.
What changes are they proposing in terms of who can be removed from the U.S.?
Okay, so that's where Section 2B of the bill comes in. And this part deals with changes to a different section of the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 237A2, which lays out all the reasons why someone could be deported.
Okay.
There are a couple of important changes here.
Okay.
First off, they're changing the heading of subparagraph,
Okay.
which currently says crimes against children, and they're changing it to and crimes against children.
Okay, so a little grammar change.
Right. It's a small tweak, but it's there.
Yeah. Okay, but there's more to it than just the heading, right?
Yeah, there's a little more to it.
What else is going on in that subparagraph?
So clause of that subparagraph, they're adding any crime that constitutes domestic violence.
Yep.
But here's the thing, they don't just leave it at that.
Okay.
They actually tell us exactly what definition of domestic violence they're talking about.
Okay, where are they pulling that from?
They point us to the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994,
Okay.
specifically Section 4002A,
Okay.
and that's where they define domestic violence.
Okay, and just for context, what was that 1994 act all about?
Yeah, so that was a huge piece of legislation. It was dealing with all sorts of crime-related issues.
Okay, so this was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a really big deal.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that this bill is very specific about saying that this definition applies whether or not the place where the crime happened actually gets grant funding under that 1994 act.
Okay, so they're really making it clear that it doesn't matter
Exactly.
whether they get the money or not, this definition still holds.
Right, it's about the crime itself.
Okay, so essentially they're saying if someone's convicted of domestic violence, as defined by that 1994 act,
Right,
they could be deported.
exactly. That's now a clear reason for deportation.
Wow. Okay, so on top of those changes to the existing rules for deportation,
Mm-hmm.
they're also adding a whole new category.
They are. They're adding a whole new subsection, G.
Okay.
And this one is all about sex offenses.
Okay, so this is to be kind of like a parallel to what they were doing.
It does, yeah.
With the inadmissibility stuff, right?
It's very similar.
Okay.
So they're basically saying that any non-citizen who's been convicted of a sex offense,
Okay.
and again, they point us back to that definition in the Adam Walsh Act,
Mm.
or if they've been convicted of conspiracy to commit one of these offenses,
Yeah.
they could be deported.
Okay, so we're seeing a real pattern here.
Yeah.
This bill is trying to expand the reasons why someone could be kept out of the U.S. or kicked out
Exactly.
if they have this kind of history of sex offenses, domestic violence, stalking,
Mhm.
child abuse violating protection orders.
It's really about broadening those grounds for inadmissibility and deportability
Yeah.
when these specific issues are involved.
And it's really important to remember that these are just proposed changes.
Right, this is all still in the works.
Yeah, this is all still kind of up in the air.
Exactly.
As we said, this bill, it passed the House back on January 16th.
Mm-hmm.
And then the very next day, it went over to the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Right, January 17th?
According to the clerk of the House, Kevin F. McCumber.
That's right.
So it's still got to go through the whole Senate process.
Exactly, it's got a long way to go.
So it's not a done deal.
Not at all.
Okay, so we've really dug into the specifics of this House Bill 30.
We have.
And it seems like to really get what this bill could mean, we really need to understand those specific definitions that they're referencing,
Absolutely.
especially the ones from the Adam Walsh Act and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act.
Yeah, those are key.
So if you really want to understand the potential impact of all this,
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely worth looking into those definitions a little bit more.
Absolutely. And it really highlights how interconnected different laws can be. You know,
Yes.
one piece of legislation can really depend on another.
Absolutely.
So it's important to see the whole picture.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we want to leave you with a question to think about. Given all these proposed changes to the grounds for inadmissibility and deportability,
Yeah.
Specifically focusing on these issues of sex offenses and domestic violence, what do you think are the broader implications for immigration law in our country?
Yeah.
And what about for the bill's stated goal of preventing violence?
Right. What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended?
Yeah, those are some big questions.
Big questions to ponder.
Definitely something to think about.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
And keep those brains working.
Keep diving deep.